I know you. You're that jaywalking punk anarchist.
You're that jaywalking punk anarchist. Jaywalking punk anarchist.
Hello, this is the Radical Reviewer taking a look at Ishmael, An Adventure of Mind and Spirit by Daniel Quinn, Bantam Books, 1992. The key idea of this text is that civilization and civilized humans perpetually violate fundamental laws of nature. This argument is developed through various conversations between the protagonist, a nameless everyman, and a gorilla named Ishmael, who discuss the impending ecological crash that the development of agriculture and industrialization will bring. The characters don't debate the virtues of direct or electoral democracy, or various economic systems or political ideologies. Instead, Ishmael takes human development to its base, primitive and civilized. Ishmael calls these two groups takers and leavers. Civilized humans are takers. They take more food than they need, more resources than they need, more land than they need, more lives than they need. Primitive humans are leavers, only taking what is necessary for life and leaving the rest alone. The text argues that civilized humans are unintelligent for blundering off the proven path and into so-called progress and development, and that non-civilized beings are actually more intelligent by choosing to live life in a manner that ensures their survival for millions of generations. Let's take a look at the text in depth. Chapter 1. This chapter is about setting up the premise of the book. To set up the story, the protagonist sees an ad in the paper stating, "Teacher seeks pupil, must have an earnest desire to save the world, apply in person." This leads the protagonist to embark in a one-on-one class with Ishmael, a talking gorilla. I know, an animal that can talk? That's ridiculous. In the first lessons, Ishmael gives the setup of how he came to be a talking gorilla, and how his prior knowledge has influenced his perspective. He states, "If gorillas were capable of such an expression, they would tell you that their family is like a hand, of which they are the fingers. They are fully aware of being a family, but are very little aware of being individuals. Here in the zoo, there were other gorillas, but there was no family. 5 severed fingers do not make a hand." This section of the text is pretty interesting, arguing that for Ishmael to learn to speak like a civilized human, he had to change his worldview. He had to think more like a civilized human. After this, Ishmael explains how society's dominant narrative has hidden and confused the means of challenging it, and the protagonist concludes, they, referring to activist movements, made an ingenious and disorganized effort to escape from captivity, but ultimately failed, because they were unable to find the bars of the cage. If you can't discover what is keeping you in, the will to get out soon becomes confused and ineffectual. Chapter 2. This chapter is about defining the terms and the main premise of Ishmael's course. Ishmael argues that civilization is a story, which our culture believes and is controlled by and is blind to. It's been said that unquestioned assumptions are the building blocks of any society, and in this strain the text argues that civilized humans should question the unquestioned beliefs that agriculture, industry, and technological development are natural and good. The protagonist states, "Even if you weren't personally captivated by the story, you were captive all the same, because the people around you made you captive." And Ishmael concurs, "That's right. Even if you privately thought the whole thing was madness, you had to play your part. You had to take your place in the story." In regards to the course, Ishmael warns, "If you take this educational journey with me, you're going to find yourself alienated from the people around you." Michael Albert also argued this point in regards to activism, claiming that when activists tell working class people to read Chomsky rather than enjoy sports, they're telling them to ostracize themselves from their peers. And at the same time, when political activist culture says that sports are for morons, that alienates activists from huge sections of the population. Chapter 3. Here Ishmael has the protagonist describe the history of taker culture. Ishmael states, "That's the premise of your story. The world was made for man." And the protagonist concludes, "If the world was made for us, then it belongs to us, and we can do what we damn well please with it." And Ishmael adds, "If the world had been made for jellyfish, things would be entirely different." Chapter 4. This chapter asks if the earth was made for man, and if taker culture is a natural process. Ishmael argues that taker culture is not a natural process, and is in fact in conflict with nature, and he states, "The world defied him. What man built up, the wind and rain tore down. The fields he cleared for his crops and his villages, the jungle fought to reclaim. The seeds he sowed, the birds snatched away. The shoots he nurtured, the insects nibbled. The harvests he stored, the mice plundered. The animals he bred and fed, the wolves and foxes stole away. The mountains, the rivers, and the oceans stood their place and would not make way for him. The earthquake, the flood, the hurricane, the blizzard, and the drought would not disappear at his command. Chapter 5. This chapter looks at what are the implications of a world made for man. And the protagonist explains, only one thing can save us. We have to increase our mastery of the world. All this damage has come about through our conquest of the world, but we have to go on conquering it until our rule is absolute. Then, when we are in complete control, everything will be fine. This is clearly a critique of the belief that science will save us, electric cars, energy-efficient light bulbs, recycling, etc. The text argues that these are false solutions and only serve as justification for civilization's continued conquest of the world. And Ishmael concludes, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with people. Given a story to enact that puts them in accord with the world, they will live in accord with the world. But given a story to enact that puts them at odds with the world, as yours does, they will live at odds with the world. Given a story to enact in which they are the lords of the world, they will act like lords of the world. And given a story to enact in which the world is a foe, and one day, inevitably, their foe will lie bleeding to death at their feet, as the world is now. This statement nicely fits with Derek Jensen's 10th premise from Endgame, which states,
the culture is driven by a death urge, an urge to destroy life.
Chapter 6. This chapter is about takers versus nature. This chapter argues that the gods played 3 tricks on taker culture. 1. Man is not the center of the universe. 2. That man evolved from the same primordial slime as everything else. And 3. That man is not exempt from the laws of nature. Though these ideas are understood now, civilized culture still lives as if humans were the center of the universe, superior to all other animals, and above the laws of nature. Chapter 7. This chapter is about taker culture violating the laws of nature. Firstly, Ishmael explains that the gazelle and the lion are enemies only in the minds of the takers. The lion that comes across a herd of gazelles does not massacre them as an enemy would. It kills one, not to satisfy its hatred of gazelles, but to satisfy its hunger. And once it has made its kill, the gazelles are perfectly content to go on grazing with the lion right in their midst. And Ishmael goes on to define the peacekeeping law. He lays out all of evolution, from stonefish to reptiles to mammals to humans, and explains that this has only taken place because up to this point, no species has declared war on other species. This is the same argument Kropotkin made in Mutual Aid, stating, but if we resort to an indirect test and ask nature who is the fittest, those who are continually at war with each other, or those who support one another, we at once see that those animals which acquire habits of mutual aid are undoubtedly the fittest. Chapter 8. This chapter continues to look at taker culture violating laws of nature. To start, the protagonist states, there are 4 things the takers do that are never done in the rest of the community, and these are all fundamental to their civilizational system. These 4 things are: 1. Takers exterminate competitors. For example, deer don't kill elk so that they can have more access to foliage. 2. Takers destroy competitors' food to make more room for their own food. For example, cows don't destroy brush and chop down trees to allow more room for grasslands. 3. Takers deny competitors access to food. For example, a wolf pack may defend its kill, but a wolf doesn't claim the entire herd as its own. 4. Takers store extra food. For example, goats don't mow down grass and store it up for the winter. This last point is a little missed on me, and the book admits that bees store their food, and even that all animals store food in the form of fat. Maybe a better rule would have been something to do with takers transporting food. Civilized humans are the only species to have access to winter vegetables and tropical fruits all year round. With all this, the protagonist comes to the conclusion, I no longer think of what we're doing as a blunder. We're not destroying the world because we're clumsy. We're destroying the world because we are, in a very literal and deliberate way, at war with it. And Ishmael explains the ABCs of ecology, that In the natural community, whenever a population's food supply increases, that population increases. As that population increases, the food supply decreases, and as the food supply decreases, that population decreases. I'll critique this argument in just a moment. Another law Ishmael mentions is the law of limited competition, which argues that takers don't only destroy competitors, wolves eating cows, they destroy competitors once removed, elk eating our cow's grass, and competitors twice removed, trees restricting the size of grassland. This causes a rapid drop in biodiversity as more land and resources are used for the benefit of one species and its direct food sources, which makes the whole system far more susceptible to catastrophe. Quinn's next premise is based on the ABCs of ecology mentioned earlier. This premise has problems. Quinn argues, so what happens when you feed the starving millions? They'll reproduce and our population will increase. Mother Culture says that humans should be exempt from that process, so when she finds a population that has outstripped its resources, she rushes in food from the outside, thus making it a certainty that there will be even more of them to starve in the next generation. The problem with this argument is that it assumes that the starving third world is overpopulated, and ignores that parts of the first world actually have denser populations by comparison. New York is far more overpopulated in the carrying capacity sense than Somalia, but that has little to do with feeding the starving millions. Quinn talks about giving contraceptives rather than food to the third world, which is incredibly offensive. This argument ignores the fact that this overpopulation has taken place as a result of globalization and capitalism's poor distribution of resources. For example, a subsistence farmer or a farmer producing for local markets has a limited carrying capacity that the population must adhere to survive. But a farmer producing cash crop for export while importing cheap subsidized food leads to a population boom, because if life is dependent on poverty wages and each family member receives poverty wages, the only way to increase your wages is to increase your family size. There is a correlation between food and population, but global poverty is a result of exploitation, not overconsumption. Overpopulation and overexploitation are interconnected but separate problems. Quinn's critique is more applicable to large cities in the first world, however, this itself is contested. Derek Jensen would agree with Quinn. Jensen defines cities as people living more or less permanently in one place in densities high enough to require the routine importation of food and other necessities of life. And therefore, cities are based on violence because if importing resources is necessary, then it might take violence to secure that importation. Minute Earth, on the other hand, would disagree with Quinn. Minute Earth argues that urban sprawl is extremely environmentally destructive, and so cities allow people to work and eat in smaller areas, which is more sustainable. Chapter 9. This chapter takes a second look at popular Bible stories, starting with a conversation between the gods on the value of life and letting one creature live or die at another's expense. Quinn equates this with the knowledge of good and evil, stating, "The gods said to themselves, 'Certainly the knowledge of good and evil is a powerful knowledge, for it enables us to rule the world without becoming criminals. This is indeed the proper knowledge of the gods, the knowledge of who shall live and who shall die.'" Most consider the biblical tree of knowledge to be about morality in general, but here Ishmael is arguing that the true danger of the tree of knowledge is the perception of knowledge, that eating from the tree will make man think he can sculpt the world in his liking, and Ishmael concludes, "If this should happen, Adam will devour the world in a single day, and at the end of that day he will devour himself." Ishmael goes on to give an interpretation of the story of Cain and Abel, and for those who don't know the story, Cain and Abel are the first sons of Adam and Eve. Cain is a farmer, and Abel is a shepherd, and God prefers Abel, the shepherd, and Cain was jealous and murdered his brother. In Ishmael's telling of the story, Abel represents hunter-gatherers, and Cain represents farmers. And after hearing this retelling, the protagonist concludes, "The tillers of the soil were watering their fields with the blood of the Semitic herders." Ronald Wright comes to a similar conclusion in A Short History of Progress, stating, "Unlike mobile foragers, sedentary people had little reason to limit the number of children who were useful for field and household tasks. Farmers soon outnumbered hunter-gatherers, absorbing, killing, or driving them into the surrounding wilderness." Chapter 10. This chapter asks, what is the right way to live? The text argues that each Lever people has a system that works well for them because it evolved among them. It was suited to the terrain in which they lived, suited to the climate in which they lived, suited to the biological community in which they lived, suited to their own particular tastes, preferences, and vision of the world. Every time the takers stamp out a Lever culture, a wisdom ultimately tested since the birth of mankind disappears from the world beyond recall. And Quinn argues that these Lever communities have all found very specific right ways to live in the world, and juxtaposes this with taker culture, which is always looking for the one right way to live. Chapter 11. This chapter looks at the taker's survival of the fittest view of nature. And Ishmael argues, man was as well adapted to life on the planet as any other species, and the idea that he lived on the knife edge of survival is simply biological nonsense. Quinn then explains that it takes a global market complex to get coffee, fruit, and other consumer goods in every supermarket, and that Ishmael thinks this is insane because it takes him no work to find something to eat, and there's plenty of variety in nature around him. Quinn argues that taker culture is on a dangerous trajectory because with each desire that is fulfilled, a new desire emerges. Takers make more and more of the earth serve humans to avoid starvation, then to survive natural disasters, then to have more leisure time, then to have industrialization, etc., etc., etc. And finally, Chapter 12. This chapter wraps up the broader concepts from chapters 2 and 3. The protagonist states, the premise of the taker story is the world belongs to man. The premise of the Lever story is man belongs to the world. And Ishmael warns, as long as the people of your culture are convinced that the world belongs to them, and that their divinely appointed destiny is to conquer and rule it, then they are, of course, going to go on acting the way they've been acting for the past 10,000 years. They're going to go on treating the world as if it were a piece of human property, and they're going to go on conquering it as if it were an adversary. And Ishmael concludes, it should be noted that what is crucial for your survival as a race is not the redistribution of power and wealth within the prison, but rather the destruction of the prison itself. Conclusion. There is often debate between reform and revolution, whether piecemeal change will solve our problems or systematic change is needed. Quinn takes the primitivist stance that economic and political reconfiguration will not be enough, and that the only solution is for all humankind to revert back to a primitive lifestyle. Now, I'm not as naive as some like Jeremy Rifkin in his The Third Industrial Revolution, or other thinkers who argue that simply recycling more and decentralization of power supplies and capitalist greenwashing is all that's needed to solve our ecological problems. I'm well aware that fixing half of what I broke isn't a solution. However, I don't think primitivism is the answer either. Instead, I argue that technology, modern infrastructure, etc., can be restructured to improve people's lives and improve ecology in a win-win. I mean, sure, returning to a primitive lifestyle would severely cut down on ecological destruction, cut down on exploitation of humans and other animals and the environment in general. However, given current society's reliance on industrial agriculture and modern medicine for survival, such a policy will result in mass death. If you're interested in a critical look at civilization and ecological destruction, if you're interested in exploring the coming ecological disaster, I would highly recommend reading this book. I would also recommend reading this book alongside A Short History of Progress. I think they pair nicely. The narrative message of Ishmael and the historical analysis of A Short History of Progress both warn that if civilization continues, then a crash is coming. If you're interested in radical theory, looking for a book recommendation or whatever, you can get your radical book reviews here with the Radical Reviewer. Thanks for watching.